Thank you for joining us. The conversation that follows is part of a project aiming to address illiberal tendencies from EU perspective and perspective of EU values, rule of law, human rights, free media, democracy. My name is Nataša Briški. I am co-founder and editor-in-chief of Metas List, media network for open-minded people of active spirit. And with me,
and my name is Aljaž Bitenc, blogger, podcaster, and editor of Ljubljana-based Radio Chaos.
So Project Aljaž that we are part of is going to address and communicate new political realities, among other countries from Slovenia, also North Macedonia, hate speech and populism, the issues connected to breaches of human rights and other liberal values, which are being challenged or denied to different parts of population in the last period. And with us, we have talked to Matjaž Gruden many times in various forums and content blogs that we produce. This time it's going to be on human rights, on populism. So Matjaž, we are really happy that you are joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Matjaž, I haven't said yet a lot about you. You are a director of democratic participation at the Council of Europe, which includes Council of Europe activities and programs in the area of education, including education for democratic participation or citizenship, youth cooperation, culture. And could you just walk us a bit through what are your job activities? What are you mostly occupied with?
It's a little bit difficult. I think we're going to spend most of the time we have on descriptions. I'd rather just very briefly explain what we're trying to achieve through our activities. I mean, the title democratic participation is somehow vague and mysterious, but it actually stands for all different activities that are meant to contribute, create, nurture, and expand that democratic environment, which is necessary for the democratic institutions to function, both at European level and at national level. At European level, of course, with the European Court of Human Rights, where we are trying to contribute to the circumstances in which Europeans are going to understand, engage, embrace, support, have the opportunity to participate in the democratic life, and we are helping our member states to do the same thing at national level through in the areas which you have mentioned: culture, heritage, education, and youth.
Matjaž, even since my early adulthood, and I'm not the youngest person around anymore, I've been hearing terms such as democratic deficit and democratic participation and youth engagement, etc., etc. And yet it looks from today's vantage point that the world back then, let's say 20 years ago, was, to put it very crudely, more democratic than the world around us is today. I mean, what was once something, a curiosum somewhere in the other parts of the world, anti-democratic forces, is today present all around us. We have illiberal populism. We have electoral autocracies. What went wrong?
Many things, I think, and many things have to be repaired in order to get things right again and get our act together in terms of functioning democracy. I think what happened, if I can sort of focus on one issue, is that for many reasons, a number of people in a number of countries around the world, not just in Europe, had a feeling they have been socially marginalized, economically marginalized, deprived, and also politically disenfranchised. For a number of reasons. I think that we have seen that when the segment or the set of political rights, political freedoms have been started to be dissociated from the issues of social justice, social equality, which has been very much present. If we are talking about Western Europe in the first decades after the Second World War, we're talking about the welfare state, regardless of which political option has been in power, which had always made, I mean, this was not an issue of disagreement. There were different ways in which Christian Democrats or Social Democrats would be approaching this issue with different emphasis, going to different lengths. But there was a societal consensus, political consensus, that social rights, social justice is a part of the societal model, civilization model. And that somehow started to break up in, what should we say, early 80s, when, and you know, she must be jumping up and down of joy in her grave, Margaret Thatcher, because she's been quoted so often in the recent days. Her famous sentence that there's no society, I think, really pins it down. It's really in one sentence. I mean, and that, of course, contributed to the fact that many people felt, as I described, they felt. They also in that caused frustration, that caused anger, that caused sense of injustice, very often completely justified sense of injustice. I also said they felt politically disenfranchised because they had a feeling they don't matter, they don't have any influence, their vote doesn't matter. And when people are in that state, they're very vulnerable and open to any alternatives, including those who are different from the ones which, you know, from liberal democracy. And
due to, I mean, COVID-19 and the pandemic certainly accelerated certain things. Now, in terms of human rights, would you say that what you are observing in the past year and a half, things turn to the worse, to the better? What are your views?
Well, unfortunately, I think things are, the tendencies are negative and rather worrying. There has been hope, and I admit I was one of those who hoped that in times of such a duress, such a traumatic period, which is really putting everyone to the test as individuals and as a community, we will be able to find what's best, strongest in ourselves. But I'm afraid we are seeing very often the contrary. And when it comes to human rights, of course, there are a lot of people who are talking about human rights now, many more than you know, they were a couple of years back, where human rights were either repeated as ritual platitudes or even depicted as something negative, as some sort of unwarranted privilege of unwelcoming minorities or unworthy minorities at the expense of hardworking taxpayers. But now a lot of people discovered human rights, but the problem is they only discovered their own rights. And again, we are seeing a similar parallelism that I said before. You cannot only look at your rights without recognizing and respecting the rights of others. It's a part of the package, and with that relationship to the community, to other persons, I think we are seeing regression. And in that way, unfortunately, the whole human rights mechanism cannot function. It's not meant to be selfish. Human rights do not require us to be good or bad or anything. They're not conditioned, subject to condition. We don't have to deserve to have human rights. But in order for the whole system to function, we have to recognize that it's not only us who has rights.
It would seem that, especially going into the pandemic, the powers that be and the citizens took a lot of these things for granted, that the rule of law is there to stay, that human rights are there to stay, and that they can be tinkered with in order to make shortcuts through the pandemic and through say managing of the entire situation. And yet now we seem to have discovered that that is not so, that there are no shortcuts, and that human rights and rule of law and democracy in general are not to be taken for granted. Do you think that this realization has set in with the governments, with the state, with the general population?
Part of states, part of governments, part of the general population, perhaps. I'm sorry, I don't want to evade it. I mean, I want to be evasive. I think we are seeing that, you know, it's dawning on some what is happening, but not all. And there are still a number of people who, for all sorts of reasons, perhaps the least ideological. I mean, you know, this kind of process is run on opportunism and pure robbery. I mean, this is not an ideological thing we are seeing. We are seeing attempts to undermine a legal, economics, civilizational model that we have put in place, not because there are people who would have ideologically creative ideas that to do something else, but for purely material reasons. So, and the difficulty, of course, is that we are lacking still historical knowledge, understanding, memory of what actually can happen and what actually happened in Europe when we were going through similar processes. We have, since 1989, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, a whole generation of Europeans, adult Europeans, grew up without really spending much time, thought, or being taught or explained why certain things are important, why democracy is important, why human rights is important, and what happens when there's no more democracy, no more human rights, what may happen to them if this happens. So, you know, they couldn't care less. And we see that among a lot of people, and what's most worrisome among many young people across Europe. And we're not just talking about countries with shorter democratic experience. We're talking about countries which, you know, in the Western Europe, which have had centuries of experience with democracy, but it still shows that it can be extremely fragile, and that is dangerous.
Now, the times are definitely challenging and dangerous, as you are saying. We have seen attacks on the rule of law, on democracy, on the human rights, but also on the media freedom. Now, you have founded, the Council of Europe have founded a platform for the protection of journalists. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit how it's working. How are the media and journalists using the platform, you know, to raise the alarm, to talk about the attacks, and to look for solutions or help from others?
Okay. Well, basically, just to start with, everything we do at the Council of Europe at the end is aimed at supporting the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, just here across the street where I'm sitting right now. You know, each of its individual articles. And for many of the articles, like protection of the ban on torture and others, we have specific conventions covering that field with the monitoring mechanisms that are helping us to get a picture of member states' compliance with this specific article. There was no such mechanism for Article 10, which is protecting the right to freedom of expression, which of course includes media freedom. And that has been really a blind spot for a long time that many have been criticizing the Council of Europe for, because we really had to wait for the European Court of Human Rights to rule on a case before we formally had this in our eyesight. So as there was no appetite among member states to have yet another convention that would be focusing on media freedom and freedom of expression, because they said they are suffering from media fatigue. I think it was more a compliance fatigue, but that's not matter. We came up with this very novel, very different proposal to organize a joint venture between an intergovernmental organization, the Council of Europe, and the civil society. So we together created a platform, an online platform, on which these organizations, international journalist associations and associations advocating for media freedom, have the right to publish alerts, publish their concerns about attacks on journalists, attacks on media freedom, without us having, as the council, having any opportunity to alter, block, censor its content. And then the member states concerned are invited to respond. And when possible and when necessary, the Council of Europe gets involved in a follow-up to find an adequate remedy. So in itself, it's quite an intrusive mechanism. Some member states are realizing how intrusive it is because it's immediate, because it's public, because it's transparent, and because they have themselves created it and they have invited civil society to alert them, and that also puts a pressure on them to act and to respond.
Now, this media alert mechanism, which is very welcome and has raised alarm in many countries that previously we would not have thought as being countries offending or with instances of offending media freedom, such as Slovenia, in the case of a Slovenian press agency, for example. But this is only one piece of a larger puzzle in defending and promoting the interconnected concept of media freedom, human rights, rule of law, democracy in general, etc. In your view, and I keep asking this all of our guests, Nataša, who or what are the natural allies in this fight or in this struggle, nationally and internationally? Who should work together, and where should help be sought in this fight?
Okay. I mean, first of all, we're talking about an essential, fundamental precondition for democracy. Okay, without media freedom, you have no democracy. You can do whatever you want, you're not going to have it. It's not going to be cold, and it's going to go in the other direction. So that should also help you to identify who the allies would be. Well, all those who care, want, are ready to engage, commit, and protect a properly functioning democracy. And it can also help you to identify who are the problem in that story. So I'm not going to go say it's really everybody. I mean, it concerns everybody. We're talking about every citizen. We're talking about institutions. We're talking about business. We're talking about civil society. We're talking about academia. I mean, everyone who's rational and believes in democracy is your not just your ally. It's directly concerned. So should be involved at national level. And then, of course, at international level, I mean, clearly the European Union, which is, I think, really in the recent years been putting a lot of emphasis, focusing on the issue of media freedom and more. And the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe also, and in particular because it is an institution which is there to support the European Code of Human Rights. And ultimately, the European Code of Human Rights is the one that can bring remedy. But we would all wish that we don't have to go that far. That's why we have a platform to identify problems early and provide an opportunity to member states to find a solution before they end up at the court. But even before that, one would hope that you would find a solution at national level. And I think as a general principle, I think it's extremely important to have allies, to have pressure, to have support, to have guidance from European level, be it from Brussels, from Strasbourg. But the one thing is clear, the solution will always have to start and will have to be found at national level. Nobody will make us democratic against our will or without our participation.
And that brings me to another topic that you have written about in your columns that you publish in the Slovenian daily Večer, the topic of, or the question of populism. Now, maybe it's just my impression, but I see that it is on the rise. And if you could comment on how you understand the populism and why is that absolutely bad for the society, for the human rights, democracy, and media here is absolutely not being blameless.
Yeah, I think it's always good to clarify what we mean by using the term that is very widely used, but very seldomly understood in the same way. And populism, for many people, for a long time, also had sort of positive connotation because it was an alternative to politics as being an alienated instrument of elites against the, people who felt marginalized, which I've described, which was very often true, was a true description. So there you go, you have a populist, he's the one who talks to the people, who says the right things, who helps them, who's the only one who's on their side. So it had a lot of attraction for a lot of people in all sides of the political spectrum. Now, I think that's wrong. I mean, I'm not contesting that politics for a long time, for the reasons I've mentioned before, have been and justifiably could be seen as alienated and insensitive to what citizens, people needed, expected, wanted from it. But I think that the alternative, the solution should be to repair that and not provide alternatives which are not democratic. So for me, populism simply is a methodology, because it's not an ideology. Methodology to seize power and stay in power at all costs by claiming an exclusive right of the representation of the people. So the populist is the one who says, I'm the only one who represents the people. I'm the only one who knows who the people are. I'm the only one who knows what people want. And by then, you, of course, automatically put yourself above not only all your political competition, which are by default illegitimate, as they are not representing the people, but also outside the scrutiny of the judiciary, civil society, which can be called black foreign agent, or critical media, which become fake news media and so on. So it's a very practical, very efficient way of putting yourself above all the democratic means of checks and balances, to say, because I represent the people, I can do whatever I want, because I do it for the people. And that is not good.
So we could perhaps possibly say that populism is just one of those shortcuts I've been describing earlier in our conversation, as a way to go through the pandemic and the current situation without actually adhering to all the mechanisms of the rule of law and a liberal democracy.
Well, I mean, all this started, of course, well before the pandemic. The pandemic just created an additional atmosphere in which this could accelerate and blossom fully, because populism, of course, requires strong emotions. It thrives on fear, it thrives on hate, and pandemic provides enormous amounts of fear, of anxiety, but as we see also of tensions, aggression, and hatred within a society, polarization. And that's fantastic. That's like, it's like kids crying in Monsters Incorporated. I mean, that's the way the populism uses those emotions. So it accelerated in many ways, but the pandemic didn't, of course, create the populism. What is worrisome, of course, that at a certain point, populism, which may start with a very broad popular support, because for the reasons that we talked about, many people are unhappy, many people are frustrated, many people want change, and they don't have the understanding of what this change may bring to them. So they're ready to support a new face, somebody, a strong person. But at a certain point, many of them, perhaps not all, but many of them will realize they're not getting much out of that equation, and they're being at the end left behind, and they have been exploited and used for somebody else's benefit, and that creates additional anger. Now, it would be naive to think that that anger will then topple populism and bring us back democracy. It can actually make things even worse because that anger, secondary wave of frustration and anger, may again be manipulated and directed at different groups within the society, and especially it can tipple sort of an illiberal Democrat into a bona fide full-scale authoritarian, because at a certain point, just whipping up the tensions, polarizations, hatred, fear in a society is not enough to maintain control. So the only answer that, of course, then is left to somebody in this position is repression.
Since you mentioned monsters, one question on also it involves your daily activities, and that is educating young and encouraging active citizenship. Do you see that younger people are becoming more and more active, more and more engaged into finding solutions for the challenges that are ahead of us? Or are you more of maybe observing more passivity from them?
I think what we see is that more and more young people are concerned, they're worried, and they become engaged and active. So that's very good. And also because, and absolutely necessary. On the other hand, we should not immediately jump to a conclusion that just because they're concerned and worried and active, they would be automatically also progressive and adhering to the values that we're talking about of liberal democracy based on respect of human rights. There's a lot of anger there too. And we have seen very recently a research I came across which showed that, in Europe, more than half of young people actually put greater trust in authoritarian regimes than democratic regimes when it comes to dealing with the climate change. So these are kind of things that have to worry us. But it should not, I'm not saying this because I would, just want to criticize or badmouth young people. I think they have, this is a result of mistrust in the institutions, political institutions of democracy. They actually simply think that they are ignoring them, they're not listening to them, and then they're, looking for different ways of expressing their concerns and expectations and defending their interests. So the way forward should really be to close that gap of mistrust in whatever way possible. It's not something we can just simply demand from young people. Say, now it's enough, go and trust, go and vote and put your trust in democratic institutions, because they have good reasons for this mistrust. We have seen that everything that happens to us as community of people, as a humankind across the world, in some ways, very often inflicts even greater pain to young people than other generations. So they have reasons to be unhappy, to be mistrustful. So it's the institutions that need to make that, create the circumstances to bring young people back, because we need them. We need to have them on board to resolve not only the problems regarding democracy, but technology-related issues, climate-related issues. And that, I think, is essential. And we won't be able to do it without young people, because we need their creativity, we need their perspective, we need their energy, we need everything. I mean, we old geezers are not going to be able to do it on our own.
And on that note,
even if you wanted to.
Totally agree.
And on that note, a semi-optimistic note, let's call it like that. Matjaž Gruden, thank you very much. Clearly, there is work to be done, but at least the path or multiple paths forward are realized, if not yet taken. Thank you so much for your time, and all the best.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Matjaž.